Welcome, everyone. And thank you for tuning in to the special session of the Climate Adaptation Summit on accelerating African adaptation. In Africa, the consequences of climate change, such as droughts and floods, are already being felt. But the continent has already shown its inherent strengths and adaptive capacity. Lots of innovative and creative solutions exist, but more urgency, innovation, and scale are needed. That is why today I'm honored to welcome excellencies and distinguished guests from government, civil society, financial institutions, and more to unlock ambition and action to accelerate adaptation in Africa. My name is Lex Woodley, and with me in the studio is Her Excellency Sigrid Kaag, Minister for Foreign Trade and Development Cooperation of the Netherlands. Welcome.
Thank you.
And dialed in from Nairobi is our moderator, Ms. Wanjiwa Matai, Vice President and Regional Director of WRI Africa. Welcome to you too.
Thank you.
And we are extremely pleased and honored to have so many excellent speakers today, all of them leaders on adaptation in Africa. And you, the audience, can be part of the conversation as well. The chat box is open, and there are opportunities to ask the guests specific questions. Just use Ask the Guest button on your platform. Throughout the session, we will ask some of your questions to our guests, so please feel free to be part of the session by submitting your questions. Now, to kick off this session, let's start with a message from African thought leaders on what is needed to accelerate African adaptation.
Climate change is a fact in Africa now. We need a profound transformation in all aspects of society in order to contain the wider impact of climate change. In many parts of Africa, for the people who has 40 years old and above, they really don't need science and then to understand that climate has changed, because they have seen it, they live on it, and then they try the best they can adapt.
We've seen that specific species are disappearing due to increase in temperatures. We've seen this mass extinction of insects. So this is, in effect, a very dangerous period that we could be entering.
The biggest challenge that Africa has is we've yet to document all that we have and how we should protect it.
Il y a des initiatives déjà qui sont développées au niveau.
There are initiatives.
La Grande Muraille Verte qui donne l'opportunité non seulement de reboisement donc de cette zone-là, mais permet aussi de créer.
There are English subtitles on this film. That's a message from the interpreter.
Because it covers over 21 countries within the Sahelian region, and we're beginning to see how the land is beginning to respond to this restoration agenda and really addressing the effects.
I think Africa is the place to be in right now, because I believe we have a lot of climate solutions if only we took time to look at the grassroots and find out how people are coping. I'll mention one project where communities have come together to restore their mangrove forests and are benefiting from carbon credits.
We are still developing as a continent, so that gives us an opportunity, I think, to leapfrog, I think, some of the bad investments that we've seen. In my opinion, we've got to be investing a lot in the people, because that's the greatest resource that we have.
And that is something that gives me a lot of joy, gives me a lot of hope that we've got young people who are willing to scale up the solutions that are being done at the local level. If we have the political goodwill, if we have the policies that prioritize the effects that arise from climate change, then we as a people are resilient enough to adapt to this.
Loud and clear there from some of Africa's leading voices. Thank you all very much. And thank you, Minister Kaag, for hosting this session, highlighting the importance, the urgency of climate adaptation action. Now, before we get into any discussions, I'd like to invite you, Minister Kaag, to share your thoughts about the ambitions for this session. Please.
Thank you very much, Wanjira. Delighted to see you on screen. And of course, we are a sort of a proud host, but this is for Africa, by Africa, and all voices from Africa, because this is the continent and its vibrancy and its creativity that is rising to the challenge. And the challenge is big. So why are we hosting it? Because the industrialized world has caused climate change. We're asking a lot of the African continent to deal with climate change. The mitigation agenda we're all working towards, but in adaptation lies the future of the challenges of the next decade. So I'm delighted that we have governments, civil society actors, academia, and of course also the private sector. Because now is the time, and we keep saying this for years, but if we, at this crossroad, at this juncture, do not make the right choices, we are failing the billions of people on the African continent, and they have a bright future ahead of them. So we need to invest, we need to give access to the tools, the knowledge, and of course we know there are tremendous examples, such as the African Climate Commissions, and we need the countries and their leaders, civil society and political leaders, to really drive the change and have access to finance and the solutions that can help the continent thrive and live up to the promise of its population. So this is the why, and it's also part of the answer of climate justice, to my mind.
Thank you for that. Indeed, ambition will be the word for this year, and we heard that throughout the opening and now in the road to COP26. Now, water, agriculture, and resilient economic growth are all critical pillars of adaptation. Quite frankly, they're the most affected sectors by climate change. Madam Minister, in your capacity as the Dutch Minister for International Cooperation, what is your focus for these specific sectors?
Of course, as the Netherlands prides itself on its knowledge of water, we do know how to manage the abundance of water or shortage thereof. We have the skills, we have the experience. We can assist farmers, we can assist countries in having the right blueprints, but also to advise and accompany local communities to manage water. Drought, as well as deal with water management to really have crops fertilized at the right time. At the same time with agriculture too. Everybody knows our University of Wageningen. There's a lot of extension work being done, and we need to really be there to provide communities with their journey towards African solutions. It requires knowledge, expertise, access to data, and we have the know-how, and we want to enable communities and their leaders to make it happen by themselves. So investing in climate-smart technologies, but really focus on agriculture and water management is really where we shine. We're good at it, and we also believe that's where the economy can really take off.
You're absolutely right, Madam Minister, and actually significant investments would be needed, wouldn't they, for across different sectors. The truth of the matter is that the COVID-19 crisis has hit just about every country in the world pretty hard. And do you think it's actually possible to address climate action while also recovering from this pandemic?
Yes, not because it's possible, because people are necessarily very inclined to do so, because it's a must. And this is the higher priority. It is the higher urgency. And I think the Secretary General of the United Nations on the onset of the COVID-19 crisis said if we are affected by this pandemic, the health pandemic, we are not ready yet for what is to come due to the impact of climate change. So we better get our act together. We need to invest in order to prevent, and we need to protect. And we need to protect human beings, livelihoods, and we need to protect the planet from a viewpoint of land, earth, water, but also biodiversity. So I believe the African Ministers for Environment have an action plan. Again, we need to make sure that there's an integrated approach, and the Green Climate Fund, of course, supports the African Union to really work its way at country level. But we can't do it from the Netherlands, The Hague, but we can rally the political will, we can advocate, and of course we can ensure that the right minds and funds are there to support Africa's journey.
You're absolutely right. You heard it across the entire opening, all hands on deck. Thank you so much for that. And you said it, we will not have a second chance. Thank you, Madam Minister. Lexter, over to you.
Yes, one of the most important institutional players on adaptation in Africa is the African Development Bank. I'm honored to introduce our next speaker, His Excellency Dr. Akinwumi Adesina, President of the African Development Bank and GCA Commissioner. Thank you for joining us today.
Good to be with you.
Could you shed light on the efforts of the bank geared towards adaptation in Africa?
Absolutely. Well, let me just say good evening to everybody. I'd like to thank the government of Netherlands for organizing this Africa Dialogue, and to express in particular my appreciation to you, Minister Kaag, for your strong support for the African Development Bank Group. I also want to thank you for your strong leadership and for hosting us for this dialogue on climate change in Africa. We live today in very challenging times with the COVID-19 pandemic. As we work to build back Africa's economies, we must do so in ways that build climate resilience. Otherwise, climate change and its attendant huge adjustment costs will further weigh down Africa's economic recovery trajectory. The African Development Bank is at the forefront of climate finance for Africa. The African Development Bank quadrupled its financing for climate to reach $25 billion by 2025. We expanded the percentage of financing devoted to climate adaptation from 26% in 2016 to 55% in 2019. The bank launched the Desert to Power Initiative, a $20 billion initiative to build the world's largest solar zone in the Sahel. The bank will mobilize $6.5 billion in support of the Great Green Wall of the Sahel, Africa's environmental defense shield, and I'm so proud to be a champion of that from President Macron of France. The former United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon and I jointly established the Global Center for Adaptation in Africa, GCA Africa, hosted at the bank and supported also by the government of Netherlands. Together, the African Development Bank and GCA Africa has launched the Africa Adaptation Acceleration Program to mobilize $25 billion in climate finance for Africa and to scale up transformative actions on climate adaptation. For example, our digital agriculture flagship will leverage $2 billion to deliver climate advisory services to reach 300 million farmers by 2030. We will roll out the first digital agriculture financing facility for Africa. Our youth adaptation flagship will unlock $3 billion for the youth, support 10,000 youth-led SMEs in climate resilience, and to build capacity for a whopping 1 million youth on climate adaptation. We will scale up the bank's Africa Disaster Risk Facility that has already provided $10 million to insure countries against extreme weather risks, including Madagascar, Mauritania, Zimbabwe, and Niger. We will also scale up the bank's technologies for African agricultural transformation. We call it TAAT, T-A-A-T, that has already provided 19 million farmers with climate resilient agricultural technologies in 27 countries, raising farmers' yields by 60%. The Africa Adaptation Acceleration Program will deliver climate adaptation for Africa at scale. The program should be robustly supported. Now, to achieve more, developed countries, of course, must now meet their promises to provide $100 billion per year for climate finance for developing countries. Africa has been shortchanged by climate change, and it should not be shortchanged by climate finance. So let's turn words into action, hope into reality, promises into financing for Africa. Together, we adapt. Together, we prosper. I look forward to working with you, Honorable Minister, and to working with the government of Netherlands and all of you to make this happen for Africa. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, President Adesina, for those hopeful remarks. It's always a pleasure to listen to you and for demonstrating the crucial progress being made, but also the gaps on adaptation on the continent. Thank you. Now, 3/4 of Africa's population is under the age of 35, and they remind us often that it is their future that's at stake. It's therefore crucial that we listen very closely to what they have to say. So next, we will hear from one of the voices of youth leadership in adaptation, Nisrin El-Sayim. She is the chair of the UN Youth Advisory Group on Climate Change. Nisrin.
Humans used to live in a better, homogeneous situation with the planet. The current world is not the world we want to live in. In Africa alone, last year, 2020, more than 11 African countries experienced a very heavy floods. Floods that caused losses in lives, assets, and made more than hundreds of thousands homeless people. It's affecting our infrastructure, affecting our economy, and affecting our daily life. We need to adapt now. In Africa, adaptation is in the center of the climate agenda. It's our only way out to live with climate change. COVID-19 made a huge example of the hard situations and how humans need to develop ways of adapting with the hard situations. Imagine what climate change will do. Here, we need to strengthen the good governance. We need to strengthen the transparency systems in Africa and around the world. We need to ensure the flowing of finance and resources to our national adaptation plans, to the adaptation fund, and also for the adaptation activities within our national determinate contributions. We also looking forward to the upcoming summits in 2021, like the Food Systems Summit, the Sustainable Energy Summit, and COP26, of course, to put focus and more light on adaptation. Well, I argue policymakers, decision makers, and world leaders to remember their promises to the next generation, to the planet, and to do climate action with adaptation and focus.
Absolutely, Nisrin. A clear call from the next generation that we keep our promises to them. Thank you for that. Now, this starts with raising ambition for adaptation and action, which is what we will now dive into with our first panel of leaders. We know there should be a balance between adaptation and mitigation, but adaptation action is lagging seriously behind. It's therefore my honor to introduce His Excellency Professor Lee White, Minister for Water, Forest, the Sea and Environment of Gabon, to kick us off. Your Excellency, from your perspective as the AU champion for climate change, what are the priorities and opportunities for climate action in Africa? Welcome.
Thank you, and good evening, everybody. Africa is the continent that is most at risk from the impacts of climate change. Unchecked, climate change will enlarge deserts and shrink lakes. It will cause untold suffering through more and more frequent and ever more severe droughts, while sea level rise will flood our coastal cities and render coastal agriculture untenable through salt infiltration. It will acidify our oceans and seriously impact the fisheries that are critical to food security in much of Africa. There are even indications now from the Amazon that our rainforests, which today play a critical role in mitigating climate change, might start to sicken and burn, fragilizing the livelihoods of millions of forest-dependent people. The result will be tens, even hundreds of millions of climate refugees in coming decades, destabilizing countries and entire regions. Indeed, as early as 2009, the Africa Progress Panel predicted that in the future, I quote, climate change will cause armed conflicts in 23 African countries and political unrest in another 13. Africa will have to replant forests and restore degraded areas at a scale never seen before, reinforce its seawalls and move coastal cities, transform its agriculture. We will have to bolster already challenged medical health systems and redesign cities. This conference, as well as the emerging alliance between the African Adaptation Initiative and the Global Center for Adaptation, are signs of hope that the global community is starting to accord equal priority to both climate adaptation and mitigation. There is no time to lose. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for your contribution. I hear there are many opportunities for action, so that's good. I would like to invite our next speaker, Her Excellency Josefa Sako, African Union Commissioner for Rural Economy and Agriculture, to share what the African Union is doing. As mentioned, the agricultural sector is particularly affected by climate change. Your Excellency, what are the key actions needed for the transformation to a climate-resilient agricultural sector in Africa? Just checking in to see on which screen
Thank you for giving me the floor. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, all protocol duly observed. Good afternoon to you all. I would like to take this opportunity to first of all thank the Dutch government through the Minister Kaag for the invitation and hosting us in this dialogue. Answering to your question, I'm very happy that you gave me the opportunity to share what African Union is doing in terms of climate change and adaptation, because I'm the Commissioner for Environment as well at the Commission. Thank you very much. We are all aware that Africa is the most vulnerable to the impact of climate change and already suffering from its worst effects. This impact could roll back much of our hard-won progress on the development. Climate change threatens food security, creating a stumbling block to our continental target of ending hunger by 2025 and the aspiration of Africa's Agenda 2063. It affects food production, availability of food, accessibility of food, quality of the food we consume, utilization, as well as the stability of the food system. We know we are going to have our summit this year on food system. In this regard, it is needed a climate finance. We need a climate finance and a national climate finance, and particularly increasing flows and impact. Renewable energy, energy efficiency, and national just transition program, nature-based solution and biodiversity, sustainable land management, resilient agriculture, green and resilient cities, and enhancing information communication and technology. In summary, a climate-smart development could drive major increase in African agricultural output. Promotion of climate-resilient development pathway requires a multilateral approach and strong partnership to address the impact of climate change, increase climate resilience, and the adaptive capacity of our communities. I will share with you some action that is going on at the African Union. The Commission has embarked on several efforts towards the green recovery from the current COVID-19 pandemics. In November, the Commission convened a special session of ministers responsible for environment and natural resources to discuss the challenges and opportunities presented by COVID-19 pandemic. The meeting adopted key recommendations and a ministerial declaration on a green recovery. The Commission also supports the upscaling of ongoing initiatives aimed at building the resilience of community at the continental, regional, and national level to build the resilience of community and society. This initiative includes the building resilience for disasters in community and regions in Africa, the Great Green Wall for the Sahara and Sahel initiative, and at the continental level, the African Adaptation Initiative, and the Initiative on Adaptation of African Agriculture, the TAs, and several commendable efforts at the national level. The Commission is also supporting the implementation of programs that strengthen climate information service value chain, from access to information, generation and provision of climate service, capacity building, and enhancing engagement between information producers and information users. The GFCS program, for example, aimed to build the capacity of member states and the RECs in the generation of climate information in agriculture and food security, disaster risk reduction, forest, health, water, and energy. In the implementation of this initiative, the Commission remains committed to ensure that the needs of vulnerable groups are taken into consideration through, for example, ensuring gender-sensitive policies are mainstream across the relevant sector, and in particular in microfinance, technology, agriculture, and climate change. Specifically, the program aims to strengthen the entire climate information service, generation and provision of climate services, capacity building, and enhancing engagement between information producers and information users. I thank you for your kind attention. Merci beaucoup pour votre attention. Shukran.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, Commissioner Sacko, and terrific to see you. I'm really glad that you pointed out Africa's roadmap, Agenda 2063, and especially the highlighting of what will be different in this critical decade of action. Thank you. So we'll now move right into our panel discussion and have a bit of a deep dive into best practices. We'll identify and assess some of the gaps in the translation of global adaptation ambition into action. So without further ado, I want to introduce our panel members. Honored to introduce Her Excellency Jean-Jacques Mujawa Maria, the Minister of Environment of Rwanda, Dr. Ibrahim Thieu, the Undersecretary General and Executive Secretary of the UNCCD, Mayor Davies Simango, the Mayor of Bera in Mozambique, and my friend Dr. Mithika Mwenda, Executive Director, Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance. We'll go straight into it. We'll start with you, Your Excellency. Rwanda has been a leader and a frontrunner on climate adaptation on the continent, and you were the very first to submit your enhanced NDC. Congratulations. The Rwanda Green Fund for NERWA also continues to grow from strength to strength. Can you share with us, Your Excellency, how Rwanda has been able to achieve so much on climate adaptation?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Excellencies, distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon, and I extend my warm greetings from Kigali. It's a pleasure to be part of this important discussion on Climate Adaptation Summit. While globally, countries are all rightly focused on addressing the immediate health effect of the COVID-19 and associated economic fallout brought up by the pandemic, global climate change crisis remains as critical and urgent as ever. The COVID-19 virus still requires immediate and attention, and so does climate change. We simply realized and resolved that we can't afford to delay climate action and plan ahead on realistic, sustainable, and resilient recovery from the COVID-19. As one of the most vulnerable countries, Rwanda prioritized climate change adaptation and policies and strategies and ensure their implementation with aim to be a developed, climate resilient, and low carbon economy by 2050. The commitment of Rwanda to climate change adaptation was also demonstrated, as he said, in the revised NDC submitted to the United Nations Framework Convention of climate change in May last year. As you mentioned, we were the first country in Africa to submit our NDC. The total estimated cost for adaptation priorities is estimated over 5.3 billion USD out of around 11 billion USD estimated as funding to implement both mitigation and adaptation priorities. Ladies and gentlemen, the world must work together with the same spirit of global cooperation and urgency to achieve the promise of the Paris Agreement, the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol, and build a world that is sustainable for generations to come, because the next generation will judge us on our actions on climate adaptation. Significant that tough Rwanda's NDC have been submitted, but the big tasks reside ahead with mobilization of resources and implementing ambitious actions agreed upon for a better impact. Rwanda recognizes the critical role of finance to achieve the ambitious climate action. Our Rwanda Green Fund for NERWA's role and experience in a global financing framework is indispensable in positioning Rwanda to mobilize the essential climate finance at scale, and together we will achieve it. I thank you very much for your kind attention.
Your Excellency, thank you for that. We can't afford to delay climate action, but finance is key. Let me turn to you, Dr. Tew. Lovely to see you. And for a long time now, you have been dedicated to galvanizing action on land degradation, sustainable development, and climate adaptation in one of the most vulnerable and affected regions of the world, the Sahel. Tell us, how goes the battle? How have we been bold enough in using land-based approaches to help communities manage the impacts of climate change, particularly more frequent and severe droughts? How are we doing?
Thank you very much, Wanjira and Minister Kaag. Thank you very much for this opportunity. Just to be able to have a summit on adaptation is a big achievement. Congratulations. I want to, just to be in the interest of time, I will touch upon three issues. One is to respond to your question, how bold have you been? Not good enough. Land remains so far the largest carbon sink we have in the world. And in Africa, it is real. It happens that 80%, 70 to 80% of Africans depend on the primary sector for their economy, be it agriculture or livestock or fisheries or forestry and so forth. And this land is severely impacted upon by drought, desertification, climate change, and the combined effect of human activities. And this is particularly severe in the Sahel, but not only. Let me be very, very clear. The Sahel is not the only region that is affected by this. The entire continent, half of Africa, up to half of Africa is affected by land degradation. In North Africa, in Eastern Africa, Southern, Central Africa, the entire continent is affected by land degradation. And if you consider that land restoration, actions on land restoration has a positive impact on the economy, has a positive impact on business, and has a positive impact on biodiversity, at the same time, is a carbon sink. So you have multiple opportunities that can be achieved through investments on land restoration. The second message I wanted to say is that if we are serious about building back better from the pandemic, we have got to put land at the center of our activities in Africa, because we should care about smallholders. We should care about potential conflicts between farmers and cattle breeders. We should care about possible migration, the impact that land degradation may have on migration. What is left for the young person in their country, in their region to do if they cannot produce anymore? They have to flee. So if we are really serious about building back better on the economy and the economic recovery, we have to adapt. We have to invest heavily on land restoration. We have to invest heavily on ecosystem-based adaptation, forests, mangroves, drylands. It is certainly the best investments we can make. Third message is that most people see a difference between adaptation and mitigation. I see actually a bridge between adaptation and mitigation. For example, if you invest on land and it is ecosystem-based adaptation, but at the same time, it is mitigation. And I would argue that the best mitigation efforts that Africa can make would be on land restoration, on ecosystem-based adaptation, because millions of tons of carbon will be put back to soil where it belongs. It should have never been emitted, that carbon. So investing on land, investing on ecosystem restoration is certainly one of the best contributions Africa can make in terms of mitigation. The president of the African Development Bank, who spoke earlier, mentioned energy, renewable energy. Investing in renewable energy is by excellence a mitigation primarily. But if you think about it, it is also adaptation. Think about using energy for water harvesting, using energy to reduce post-harvest loss, using energy to create value chains and to keep young people in their countries. So therefore, mitigation and adaptation cannot be separated. We should seek at building bridges, and the arguments that we should make is that it is not separated. It should be developed together. Therefore, financing adaptation and funding adaptation, I see a nuance between funding and financing, but both are necessary, is absolutely critical. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tew. Land must be at the center of our action efforts. Mayor Simango, I want to come to you. 2 years ago, your city experienced the devastating impacts of Cyclone Idai, with 70% of the houses damaged, 25 completely destroyed. Sadly, disaster struck again just this weekend, with Cyclone Eloise causing loss of life and damage to your city. Our hearts go out to you and to the people of Bera. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. And I know you're working hard to rebuild and prepare for disasters in the future. What key lessons can you share from your experience in Bera regarding preparedness and early action?
Yeah, thank you so much. As you mentioned earlier, we in the Bera, we are not used about cyclone. We were suffering a lot because of flooding. We prepared ourselves to mitigate the flooding. We prepare ourselves to mitigate the coastal protection. And definitely we try to speak to the old people and ask them if they heard something about cyclone. Nobody says yes. But in these last 2 years, we had 3 cyclones. And this last one was very serious. It damaged infrastructures, buildings, killed people, about 8. We are not with power. Even now, I was not sure that I could reach the net because the net is going up and down. People be suffering by hunger because we have flooding. And this Eloise cyclone, what did west? It was more flooding and windy, but Idai was very, very windy. So you can imagine you need to learn each lesson from each type of cyclone. But we did very good prevention. That's why we didn't have a lot of damage inside the city. So it means that Bera definitely is extremely exposed to and vulnerable to cyclone, storm, and intensive rain. Another thing what we did with the Dutch is to prepare ourselves for the future, coming up with
Looks like we lost. Looks like we've lost the mayor there, and he had just mentioned. Yes, so I think we will move on to our next guest and maybe hear from him when we come back. Dr. Mwenda, come to you. You represent around 1,500 civil society organizations across 48 African countries, and there's been a lot of concern about the fact that we're lagging behind on adaptation, action, and finance. And we know about what's not going well. So no need to rehash that. But what would you say are the elements of a solidarity and prosperity package on adaptation?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Wajira. And let me join others in congratulating the Dutch government for hosting this very important summit. And secondly, the speakers who have been ahead of me, most of them, we are familiar with them. We work together with the African Development Bank, African Union, and all participants from Africa in addressing climate crisis. So the elements which, in our view, which should be anchored on climate justice are that first and foremost, we need to accept first and foremost that the problem, the challenge of climate change was not caused by Africans, it was caused by other people, industrialized countries. And that being the case, they have the responsibility of addressing that crisis. I have listened to the president of the African Development Bank. He has mentioned a lot of mobilization of money and many other things. But when we look at that, I am asking myself how much money of that reaches the people at the bottom of the pyramid. So in this case, any action on climate adaptation should consider the people at the front line of climate crisis, and these are the principles of justice which we espouse. It is easy to mention that we have mobilized money, adequate money for that reason. We can develop processes, we can develop policies and actions and strategies, but without involving the right people, the people at the front line of climate crisis, then those policies, documents, they end only gathering dust at the desks and cupboards of the governments and these intergovernmental organizations and institutions. And so we insist that, yes, Africa, we need that kind of solidarity, massive resources from industrialized countries, which is not supposed to be tokenism. It's real money in honoring their commitments in addressing climate change. As we speak now, we exhausted, we ended the second period of a commitment to the Kyoto Protocol. The industrialized countries and promised that they are going to deliver 100 billion US dollars annually. Until now, we are yet to see that money, unless we are told whether it has been mobilized by the African Development Bank or others. So these are serious issues of concern. Then the other key element of solidarity and prosperity for Africa is a comprehensive debt relief by industrialized countries. We have the crisis of COVID-19, and then we have the crisis of climate emergency. And so if we have to meet the demands, the amount of money which is required for adaptation, then we'll have to either restructure the debts which we have as Africans, or we ask for industrialized countries to cancel them altogether. In the when we are talking about building resilience of communities, adaptation, we have to understand that as no return for investment. The question is, what is the framework of the money which we have in terms of delivery and adaptation? So these are some of other critical issues we have been asking. And it's important that we build power to the people so that they can be able to determine the solutions which they have. We should not always think that communities, because they do not have resources, they have no solutions. So solutions from the people from below is very important. Then the other one is that industrialized countries should honor their commitments, as I've mentioned, but they should be based on justice and science. I'm very happy now, even the United States has returned to the Paris Agreement, and because that was our very biggest concern. We have also to make gender at the center of climate action, because men and women have different ways of absorbing the impacts of climate change, and it is important that all the two genders should be involved. We also, the youth constituency, the issue of intergenerational equity is quite important, and you have seen the youth movement and the lady who was speaking, that they have that power to change things for future generation. Then lastly, the transition to low carbon, climate resilient future is quite important. We need really to look at how we are going to address it in such a way it is not going to hurt people at the front line of climate crisis. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mithika. Really clear points there around debt, around justice, around finance, around building the trust that is very much eroding if all of this is not held together. Thank you so much. Thank you all to all our panelists. Especially want to mention Mayor Simango, who fell off the call, but who is going through this, what we're talking about, live. And for the first part of this discussion, at least we heard his voice, and I really hope he remains a symbol of why we are all here. I want to turn to you, Minister Kaag. A lot has been shared here by our panelists, some bright spots, but also some clear opportunities for ambition. What thoughts are emerging for you as you reflect on what you're hearing?
Yeah, perhaps it's not an emergence, but really it's a confirmation of the convergence of views, a shared analysis of the root causes, the need for action, both international, national and local level, and really empowering all communities. And this is often where we forget the local actors are the agents of change. They have been proven to be most resilient without ever having been supported to be resilient. They need to cope with the lot that's been given, and now we can turn the tide. I think the big picture issues are debt relief. And when we build back better from Corona, we need to invest in a different way that really not only mitigates the impact of climate change, but really fosters and encourages adaptation, as this is the road we need to take. I'm also impressed with the focus that in the different conversations came through in terms of the need to focus on the most vulnerable. We always say it, but we need to make sure we do it because they have the least adaptive capacity, be they urban poor, be they the rural farmers, of course, women in most communities, and young people that are still aspiring to build their lives, often with an uncompleted education, no jobs in sight, finding agriculture actually no longer the area of work they want to work in, but it may be the backbone of African growth and the food basket again if we get it right with mitigation, but particularly adaptation. We also know that communities can deal with a shock when they are prepared. I mean, the Sahel drylands are examples we know, and the urban areas of Bera, the city of Bera, where we have played an active part, and we will continue to be with the mayor as he builds the infrastructure and rebuilds it. So we need to also make sure that we look at climate adaptation as a way to achieve economic growth, or rather you cannot achieve inclusive green economic growth if you do not prioritize adaptation. So it's not a nice to do, it is a must and need to do. So the big clarion call, of course, is we need to accelerate adaptation, and I'm delighted, of course, also with the data work that's been done, the analytics by the Global Commission on Adaptation that has shown that if you invest in adaptation, each dollar can yield between $5 to $10 worth of investments. And this comes back to something I've been working towards in the humanitarian field. most countries are very unwilling, be they donor or partner countries, unwilling to invest in prevention. And adaptation is the biggest prevention ticket in town, but it's also the engine of economic growth. So it would be very foolish if we do not take this leap with this big step now, and we will regret, because we will all pay the price in human losses and economic losses and environmental degradation, which cannot be reversed. So that's my takeaway.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that's very, very good to hear. We have so far heard from African leaders on the actions needed and being taken. Next, we will hear the adaptation ambitions and achievements of some partners. Our first speaker on this subject is His Excellency Gerd Müller, Minister of Economic Cooperation and Development of Germany.
Dear Sigrid, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, where do we stand? Even if we manage to gradually reduce greenhouse gas emissions, climate change will continue to advance. Even if we manage to achieve the 1.5-degree target, we will have to invest in adaptation. Adaptation to climate change is a vital precondition for sustainable development. This is true worldwide. People in developing countries suffer especially under the impact of climate change, and they don't have the resources or instruments to protect themselves from floods, droughts, and storms. As a result, agricultural productivity is going down, and people are becoming even more vulnerable. Promising initiatives have been launched in Africa. We are proud to support them. For example, the African Adaptation Initiative to make adaptation more effective, and the African Risk Capacity to help countries improve their disaster and risk management. What are we doing to make a difference? More than 1/3 of our bilateral adaptation funding goes to Africa. More than 540 million euro in 2019. For example, in the city of Bera on the coast of Mozambique, we are working with the World Bank to help to build flood prevention infrastructure. Germany will remain a reliable partner. Chancellor Merkel announced that we will provide another 100 million euro to help these countries. My ministry will give this money to the Least Development Countries Fund. The fund supports 46 countries. 33 of them are in Africa. I wish you a successful summit. Thank you so very much.
Thank you. And next we have a live connection with Mr. Raffaele Mauro Petriccione, Director General for Climate Action at the European Commission. Director General, could you elaborate on the EU adaptation strategy and its implications for Africa?
Thank you very much. And good afternoon, everybody. Let me start by congratulating the Dutch government for organizing this event. It's extremely important. You asked about our new adaptation strategy, which the Commission will adopt in about a month's time, and we will propose to our member states and to our parliament. If I had to summarize, the spirit of that new adaptation is joining better knowledge and better joint actions, and demonstrate with practical implications that adaptation is as important as mitigation, and they're facets of the same effort. As Minister Müller just reminded us, even in the best of circumstances, if we were able to stop climate change at 1.5 degrees, there will be a world which is much worse than the one we face today. And well, as often happens in human affairs, it's only when people realize that things don't happen just for other people, that adaptation to climate change is a necessity for everybody, that the focus changes. And that is what's happening to Europe. Climate change is hitting Europe increasingly hard. And that has also helped Europeans to focus on what's happening elsewhere in the world. We've always dedicated a good part of our international climate finance to adaptation or joint adaptation and mitigation measures, about 50% of it. But we will now try and pursue a new approach where the European Union and our member states will join forces and scale up our joint projects on climate, in particular with African partners, to enhance our action. That means better bilateral cooperation. That means structuring better adaptation in our bilateral cooperation effort. It means supporting our partner countries in their efforts on climate change adaptation and disaster risk management. But it also means that we will call for higher climate change finance dedicated to adaptation and support greater focus on adaptation at the COP26 in Glasgow. So Africa sits very high on the EU adaptation agenda. Many of our African partners have long prioritized and shown great leadership on adaptation and resilience. They say this as an investment in a sustainable future that we can no longer afford to postpone, and they're right. And we should support them in that, and we should join them in that spirit. And we must respond to their call. Scaling up efforts on adaptation and resilience is a moral imperative, but it's also enlightened self-interest and an act of solidarity. We have, under our Global Climate Change Alliance, our flagship climate initiative, deployed over 750 million since 2007 and 2020. And through that, we have run more than 40 projects in Africa focusing on adaptation and resilience. We participate in the Economies and Land Degradation Initiative, which aims to reach 1 million hectares of land and 500,000 households in Africa by 2022. We support the local climate adaptive living facility, which has been a success story in many least developed countries. We've joined the call for action on adaptation and resilience led by UK and Egypt. And we will mobilize more than 700 million euros per year to help Africa build its great green wall south of the Sahara against desertification and drought. And we have become active in the Africa Adaptation Initiative, together with UNDP, to build up capacity and knowledge for climate adaptation. If I were to summarize what we want to achieve through our strategy in cooperation with our partners, especially in Africa, I would say 4 things. I mean, the cooperation on adaptation with Africa will have pride of place in the new strategy that we will issue next month. 2, we are ready to employ our know-how and our resources in support of our partners, but also we need to learn from our partner experience and knowledge. We need to build knowledge on how to adapt together. There is no conventional wisdom on adaptation. There is no better knowledge. There may be better means, better instruments, better resources, but the knowledge is something we can build together, and we have to build together. To that end, we need to establish adaptation dialogues at country level with regional institutions and globally. And finally, the EU will continue to engage under all these regional and global initiatives to help them deliver effectively and in full ownership. We will bring this to the fora as much as we have adaptation, as we have enhanced our ambition with our 2050 objective and our 2030 new target. We will now have to bring adaptation to the same level of political attention and concrete actions. And I'm very happy to be in this event. What we are hearing, especially from African leaders, is essential for us to strengthen our efforts in this direction.
Thank you, Director General. Next up is a video message from Dr. Yannick Glemarek, Executive Director of the Green Climate Fund. Executive Director, would you like to share the GCF's ambition on African adaptation?
Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, climate impacts are materializing far faster than expected 20 years ago. With agriculture as the backbone of Africa's economy, climate change is particularly affecting the continent. It's reduced crop productivity, with yield losses of some crops, for example wheat, a staple in many parts of Africa, projected at up to 21%. At the same time, Africa is driving the global climate and adaptation agenda. Climate resilient agriculture and clean energy access are prioritized in over 70% of African nationally determined contribution. The Green Climate Fund is the world's largest climate fund and allocates over half of its resources to finance transformative climate adaptation initiatives. Over the past 4 years, GCF has invested almost $1.1 billion of its own resources and leveraged an additional $1.3 billion in co-financing to support 44 adaptation projects in Africa. The GCF is committed to continue prioritizing adaptation investment in Africa. Notably, we are working with our partners on a four-pronged approach to scale up adaptation efforts in Africa. First, fostering integrated planning and policy development to leverage synergies between climate adaptation, mitigation, sustainable development, and COVID-19 recovery measures. Second, catalyzing climate adaptation innovations in policies, business, technologies, and finance. Third, mobilizing greater private sector investment into adaptation action through blended finance and support to domestic financial institutions. And fourth, developing tools and knowledge to mainstream climate risk into investment decision-making, such as new valuation methodologies for climate resilient infrastructure. Many thanks for your attention.
Finally, we have a live connection with Dr. Hafiz Ghanem, Vice President Eastern and Southern Africa for the World Bank.
Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, and thank you very much for allowing me to speak at this very important event. You know, Africa has contributed the least to global warming, and yet the continent is at the sharp end of its most devastating impacts. I visited Bera after Cyclone Heider, where, as Minister Müller was saying, we at the bank working with Germany are financing flood support programs. And Bera again is being hit now by another cyclone. So there's a need, obviously, for a lot of work on protecting our coastal cities in Africa. And that is an important area where we at the World Bank are doing a great deal of investment. That is obviously very, very, very important. I wanted to make a point also that Africa can seize some opportunities provided by green technologies to foster growth, and that Africa does not need to follow the old models of industrialization. Africa can chart a new course, and new technologies for green technologies are really a very important opportunity, and that is what the World Bank is working on, and that is what we call our new generation of Africa Climate Action Plan. And let me give you two examples in the interest of time, just two examples of what I mean. And the first example is from the energy sector. Today, less than half of the people in sub-Saharan Africa have access to electricity, which is a barrier for growth, diversification, health, and education outcomes. But today, the technology that drives solar power is efficient, accessible, and cheaper than ever before. We recently launched the Africa Energy Access Initiative to achieve universal access to electricity by 2030. It's an ambitious plan, but it is something that is achievable today because of the new green technologies. For example, in Kenya, we support the country's electrification strategy to expand energy services to underserved counties with an off-grid solar access project. This provides electricity to nearly 300,000 households. Similar programs for solar projects in the Sahel and in Somalia to improve energy access. All of this would not have been possible. And this hope to achieve universal access would not have been possible without the new technology. It's the same thing in the area of food security. We need to ensure food security by developing climate smart agriculture. This is central to adaptation in the continent, and the new technologies are allowing that. In Ethiopia, we are helping the government not just to improve landscape management, but also to improve crop yields and incomes for households, and to improve access to better land tenure. Same types of programs we have in Niger, in Zambia, in Nigeria. We are targeting 28 million farmers in Africa to secure food and nutrition security across 20 countries. These are just two examples of the main strands in our work, with new investments expected to reach $22.5 billion by 2025. Adaptation is really central to our climate change efforts. Even as this plan is ramping up, the COVID-19 pandemic has turned so much of our world upside down. Like climate change, the COVID-19 pandemic underscores how global issues can ripple through economies, disproportionately affecting poor communities. But as Africa navigates through the pandemic, including with a green recovery, it will emerge on the other side better placed to ramp up its development actions in a climate-informed way and grasp new opportunities. The journey may be somewhat more arduous, but the destination is no less compelling. The World Bank, working with our African partners, will do our best every step of the way to reduce poverty and keep Africa the world's most climate-friendly continent. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Ghanem. Thank you very much for that. Really important messages of solidarity, Minister Kaag, and I wish we had more time. Sadly, we do have to close this section. We need a serious shift from thinking about and talking about adaptation action to demonstrating action. What are your final, Minister, very brief thoughts on this?
On this issue or the next one? I'm just asking the moderator.
Your closing reflections on this session.
Well, on this session, I think it's very clear that we need to discuss very forcefully the issue of integrity of climate finance. That means access to finance and availability of large-scale financing that is sustainable. So not one year, it's multi-year, it's predictable, and local partners and governments can rely on this and they can invest accordingly. Equally so, what we need to do is public finance needs to be allocated 50-50, to my mind, or more, for adaptation versus mitigation. I have decided that the Netherlands a few years ago, we would allocate the bulk of our funding towards adaptation because this is the future. It's now that we need to take action. And last but not least, we need to help partners develop bankable projects. We might identify the problem, we know what to do, but if there's not a bankable program and project available, partners cannot rally around it. So there's often a gap. And what we've done through the Dutch Fund for Climate and Development, which I've launched, is that we try to bridge between communities, partners, the big finance institutions, and we can help not only build the bankable project base, but also provide the bridging financing. And I would urge many more partner countries that have the financial capital and of course need the political will to do so, they need to, hopefully they will follow suit, because this is what's also required. And then of course there's the bank. We need to look towards the IMF when it comes to debt issues and debt resolvency. But we all need to do this together and everybody can play their part. And we don't have time to lose. So I think the evidence is there and the action is also very clear.
We will need your solidarity, Minister Kaag. Thank you for those reflections and for your presence here today. And to all our distinguished speakers, thank you all very, very much. Lexter, over to you.
Yes. Again, thank you very much for your presence, Minister. And again, also to all of our speakers, thank you. I understand that you have to go. But
sadly.
Yeah, but we have our next guest lined up, so stay tuned. Because so far we have focused on unlocking ambition. Next we will reflect on the themes discussed and focus on unlocking action. But before this deep dive, we will show you a short animation on adaptation solutions.
Climate change affects us all, but hits some of us harder than others. Africa is on the front line of climate change, which impacts food security, water availability, and economic growth. The continent has already shown its strengths and adaptive capacities. Now it's time to accelerate and scale up effective adaptation solutions and build resilience fairly and equitably across society. Innovative and creative solutions already exist. In Mali, pastoralists receive text messages with information on water resources and vegetation based on satellite data. This allows them to cope with climate shocks and increase their income. After Cyclone Idai, city authorities in Mozambique are expanding drainage systems that proved effective during the storm. These systems protect urban communities from flood risks and losses. Together, we can unlock the enormous creativity and potential of individuals, communities, and businesses. And by galvanizing adaptation, action, and finance while generating economic growth at the same time, we create stronger, safer, and thriving communities, and a more resilient future for us all.
Well, in line with Corona measures, we have cleaned the table, and now we have a new guest in our studio. I would like to welcome Ms. Kitty van der Heider, Director General of International Cooperation of the Netherlands. We look forward to hearing from you on our deep dive into unlocking action for African adaptation. And we look forward to hearing from you, the audience. The chat box is still open. And we still have Wanjira with us. Wanjira, let me hand over to you.
Thank you, Lexter. That was a really good session, such crucial points emphasizing the urgency of action. But joining me now for an even more lively discussion, Director General Kitty van der Heider. Thank you so much for joining this session, Kitty. Always good to see you. And I know how important this subject is for you, Kitty. So I just want your views on the Netherlands partnership in adaptation. Why adaptation? Why Africa?
Well, first of all, Wanjira, it's a great pleasure to see you, to be here on an issue that really is a passion of mine. This isn't just work. This is something I do with all my heart. And welcome to all of you. I know it's not as we used to do it, but it's a great thing that we do it virtually because so many people can now join that otherwise would not have been able to join. So that's the one silver lining I take away from this pandemic. And welcome to so many of the African leaders and stakeholders that I'm privileged to hear and to listen to and to learn from. And we've been committed, as you know, to the SDGs, to the Paris Agenda right from the beginning. We've been a partner to Africa, not just governments, but a partner to African people for 75 years. And we're deeply committed, as the minister just said, to the Adaptation Agenda. And Wanjira, you asked why? Well, I would almost say, how can we ask this question at this age? Because if you look at the IPCC data, 10 of the climate hotspots in this world, 5 of them are in Africa. There's no continent that will bear the brunt of climate change as much as Africa. And yet we know we can, with smart investments in adaptation, make sure that people's lives and livelihoods do not suffer. We know from data that if we don't do anything, 43 million people will be plunged into extreme poverty by 2030. And we have promised them a world that is different. In the SDGs, we promised them a world with the perspective of a dignified future. We cannot achieve any of the global goals that we as a world community committed to if we do not adapt, if we do not focus on Africa. That's why we do this. I have 4 things that I think, particularly for Africa, we need to focus on, and I'll be brief. 1, we have to stop, as a world community, to use the atmosphere of this planet as the global sewer for greenhouse gas emissions. Not just energy transition, but it's energy efficiency, it's our diets, it's deforestation, it's transport, it's cities. We need to deliver what we have promised in Paris, which is $100 billion in climate finance, delivering not just to government, but to poor people so they can access and build their own future. Third, we need to make sure that now that we are investing so much money into relief and recovery of COVID-19, that we spend that wisely with the perspective of a resilient future for people in Africa. And last but not least, We need to forge long-term partnerships between not just governments, but including the private sector, including the world of science, and including local stakeholders that know so much more about what's needed at their level than we can do from this table right here.
Well, Kitty, I couldn't agree more. That all sounds really good to me, but we still seem to be struggling to convert this into action, even on commitments made. And how can we make this time different? How can we effectively plan for a resilient future with successful adaptation actions?
Look, I think there's a few points, and I think, first of all, Africa knows very well that it needs to adapt. It's for a reason that Africa has launched 3 climate commissions in the years between 2018 and 2020. That shows you that Africa is serious. Why? Because they know climate change is affecting them right here, right now. It's costing livelihoods, if not, it's costing lives. If you look at the national climate action plans, adaptation is written large all over African plans. You may not see that here in the West, but you will see it in any African climate plan. I asked in the run-up to this meeting young people what it is they think we need for a resilient future. And they came with 3 key topics to me. One, they said, look, we need much better governance of our natural resources. It's the only wealth that poor have. It's the soils on which they depend. It's the forest in which they live. It's having enough water. And managing those resources for poor people, that's going to be the future. Second, they need drought-resistant crop varieties. Obviously, we see precipitation changes across Africa. If we are to feed Africa with a growing population, we better have drought-resistant varieties. And lastly, we need to invest in solar-powered irrigation. Without irrigation, we will not be able to achieve SDG 2, but can we please do that in a way that women will benefit too, women that don't have the ownership to land and often don't have the collateral to invest in irrigation system. So yes, we must put resilience across everything we do, from now till 2030. And I know we missed the mayor of Bera, but one thing about what Bera has done that is so unique and that all of us must do, that is really putting those in the margins at the center of our decision making. It is listening to local people, the vulnerable people, the poor people, the young and the women. What is it you need for your future as we rebuild Bera? I wish that every government and everyone in the decision-making position would do that, because then we can be faster, we can be much more locally adaptive, and it's much cheaper, so we can do more for the many more people that need this. I think we need the heightened sense of urgency across all stakeholders, mayors, national governments, private sectors, the world of science. We have 9 years to deliver. That's not a whole lot of time to transform your economy. And we need to tap, as happened in Bera, into local knowledge of what is needed. We often tend to think that we can do that here from behind this table. Well, I can tell you, and Wanjira, you know that very well. If we do not tap into local knowledge, we will not be able to do it in time. We cannot accelerate, and we will not match the needs of those people that we aim to serve through development cooperation. So I will be here listening more than anything else across the next sessions and learning from what Africa needs to teach me in being effective. Thanks.
Well, Kitty, that is a very good segue into the section we're going into, very clear dialogues that will deep dive on exactly what you're talking about. Ladies and gentlemen, we're now going to shift gears and explore challenges and share best practices in 3 separate dialogues. Unlocking climate action is the theme, and the first of these will be about information and institutional development. And the second will focus on the-ground action, and then the all-important unlocking climate finance. Finally, we will have Ambassador Seni Napo of the African Adaptation Initiative, who will share his reflections on all 3. So we'll move right into the first one on institutional and information development. I want to welcome 2 incredible African leaders in this. Mr. Leslie Ndlovu, he's the CEO of the Africa Risk Capacity Limited, and then Mr. Gebru Endaliu, he's LDC Elder. Delighted to have both of you today. You've heard how much has been said about action, action, action. In the recent years, a lot of effort and resources have gone into improving early warning systems and disaster risk management. This has also been touched upon in the previous panels, especially by the Mayor of Bera. Yet in the past year, we have seen wide-scale flooding across the Greater Sahel, the Horn, leading to massive displacement, great losses of life and property. We are still not seeing the sort of early action that is required to avoid this devastation. I want to start with you, Mr. Dlovu. From your experience, what gaps still remain? Are we not doing enough? And what best practices are there in institutional arrangements so that we can crack this once and for all?
Good afternoon, good evening, and good morning to everyone. It's a very interesting question that you pose. In my view, I think the solution requires a multifaceted approach that involves both the private sector and the public sector, because no sector alone will be able to solve the problem. Speaking from the perspective of the CEO of an insurance company, there is a lot of work that still needs to go into building the distribution networks to ensure that we're able to reach as many people as possible with insurance, which will help build the resilience of local communities and ensure that they have the means to bounce back whenever they are impacted by a natural disaster. From the private sector perspective, we need to be able to frame this in the as a business case, because as Minister Kaag alluded to in her remarks, there is a very strong case to be made, because mitigation saves on average $4 to $5 relative to a dollar that is spent after the fact. Therefore, I think now that everyone is more or less convinced of the need to take urgent action, we need to then build this coalition of the private and the public sectors. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ndlovu. Ato Endali, what do you think about that? Is it really, no one sector can do it alone? Do you agree with what you're hearing from Mr. Ndlovu?
Yeah, thank you very much. First, I would like to thank the government of the Netherlands for hosting this important event. I think if we take the case of Ethiopia, I think we have been the champions in really moving from a sector-specific approach into a sector-wide approach. So I do believe, and I completely agree with Leslie, that there is no one which is immune from the impact of climate change horizontally across sectors, and everyone needs to own the process, including the private sector, research, academia, and everyone needs to be on board if we want to have a sustainable solution to the impact of climate change and variability. Thank you.
Now, for Ethiopia, Ato Gebru, you are one of the first countries to incorporate a green economy and have a sector-wide process where adaptation elements are actually built into your national development planning process. So in your view, what is working well in that and what can be improved upon? How is that process going? Can you share the best practices so far?
Well, if you take the case of Ethiopia, we've been champions in really launching the climate resilient green economy strategy during the African COP in Durban some 9-10 years back, where we were the first to have this kind of 20-year strategy. And our approach was to have a sector-wide approach, including adaptation, mitigation, as well as development, because you can't achieve development unless you address the issue of climate change. So the need for integrating climate change, adaptation, and mitigation efforts in your development plan is a key if you want to achieve a sustainable development. So we have been trying our best, and we were doing learning by doing exercise. So we started by a projectized approach, and we realized that this is not really sustainable. Now we are mainstreamed climate change into our development plans. So the lessons that we got, we have been doing like a 9 years review of the performance of our strategy before we enhance our NDC. So the message that we got was we were good in doing, but we were not good in documenting and reporting. So one of the best lessons that we need to really share with the rest of the world is that you need to, mainstreaming is not just on implementation. Mainstreaming needs to happen in planning, both short and long term, and in resource mobilization, implementation, as well as reporting. That will facilitate the global stocktake process, as well as you will learn from your performance. So you'll be guided by what you have been undertaking. So in that regard, this is the key message that we got from our experience. And in line with this, I think we have an initiative called LIFE-ER, this development initiative for effective adaptation and resilience, which is the initiative for the least developed countries, where 33 of the 47 LDCs are in Africa. Through this initiative, we are planning to really share some of the best lessons, like the lesson from Ethiopia and other countries, both in Anglophone and Francophone African countries, as well as Asian LDCs. So the best practice could be easily scaled out through this process. And we want the key message here is that the business as usual way of planning, implementation, reporting across the value chain is not sustainable. We need to have a kind of a business unusual way of doing things. And if you look at from resource perspective, nearly 10% of the adaptation finance is reaching to the local, most vulnerable communities. So in that regard, we envisage to attain 70% of the resource to reach to the local communities by 2030 through this initiative. This way, we want to influence other initiatives as well. So this cannot be done, of course, through the initiative alone. We want to bring in everyone to be on board to take be part of this vision. Thank you.
Thank you, Ato Gebru. And I want to come back, if we have time, to Mr. Globu, but I think we may have some questions from the audience. Lexter, do we have anything coming through?
Yes, we do. Here's a question to Gebru Jembe Endalawe. I hope I said your name right, Endaleo. Here's a question. What is your biggest cause for hope when it comes to the consequences of climate change?
Sorry?
Ato Gebru, did you hear that? What is your greatest hope when it comes to climate change? Yeah.
Should I repeat it? The question is, what is your biggest cause for hope when it comes to the consequences of climate change? That's the question.
Well, yeah, I'm a bit optimistic. I look one of the really the advantages of climate change for Africa is I think we were able to really plan in the medium and long term. Like if I give you a case of Ethiopia, our planning process was just 1 year, 2 year. Now with climate change, we managed to have 10 year, 20 year, and now we are working to have a 2050 strategy in line with the call from Paris. This is an opportunity because you will attain sustainable development if you are able to plan longer. That is the advantage. And of course, the disadvantage of climate change is very clear. We are in a vicious circle of poverty because if you look at the case of what's happened recently in Mozambique, like after you do a lot, then your development will be reverted back to zero with the impact of climate change variability. That will keep you in a vicious circle of poverty. That's why we have been calling for, we need to have more ambitious action to have a really a better absorbing capacity of any kind of shock, because the impact will continue for the coming years. But what we can do is increase our ambition in both adaptation and mitigation. The reason why I'm saying adaptation and mitigation is that there is no clear boundary between adaptation and mitigation, and as well as development when it comes to developing countries like us. So if we are able to integrate these three pillars and be ambitious and integrate it into our planning process, I think we'll achieve the global vision of improving the resilience to the communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Ato Gebru. I wish we had more time to go back, but very clear message there about climate adaptation action being key to development. And of course, disaster risk preparedness at the heart of that for Africa. Thank you, gentlemen, very much. Ms. Ndlovu, Ato Gebru, thank you very much for joining us today. We'll move right on to the next dialogue on adaptation, action, and interventions. Please keep your responses sharp and to the point so we can get hopefully another round through, because you're raising very interesting issues. In the second dialogue, we're going to go right into adaptation, action, and interventions. Allow me to welcome our first speaker, Ms. Abir Lemesfer. She's the Director General of the Adaptation of African Agriculture Initiative. Professor Abdoulaye Dia is the Executive Secretary of the Pan-African Agency for the Great Green Wall. Thank you very much, both of you. We all know that even if we get the institutional arrangements right, with policy and finance frameworks in place on sound evidence, the implementation challenges still remain. Where we have the right conditions in place, how are we going to translate these into action? I want to turn first to you, Ms. Lemesfer. During your time at AAAI, you have developed climate smart investment plans for many countries in the sub-region. And so tell us, what is needed, in your opinion, to translate these plans into investments and action? How do these plans get scaled up as well and benefit those on the front lines? Abir, please.
Thank you for your question. I will try to be extremely short, as you mentioned. Well, African countries need to better prepare to attract and handle climate finance for adaptation. And the financing of agriculture adaptation takes many shapes and involves. And so we want to talk about how do we translate the plans in investment. Well, I would like to say a few words about those climate smart agriculture plans at first. Those are some plans that were developed for 7 African countries: Mali, Côte d'Ivoire, Morocco, Burkina Faso, Ghana, the Republic of Congo, and Cameroon. And in a partnership with the World Bank, with l'Agence Française de Développement, with the NDC partnership, with the CIAT, and many R&D centers. And today, once we have the strategic approach and once we have the plan, we of course try to transform those climate smart agriculture investment plan into real projects on the ground, based on a very strong involvement of the themselves, of the public sector, and also of the private sector. And so that's why we are working now on the finance leveraging. And for me, it is just a way to say that there are a lot of plans and a lot of tools that are ready in the adaptation field, and especially for the adaptation of the African agriculture. And maybe if I can give a message, or if I can make a wish in my participation with you today, is that please don't try each time to reinvent things and to spend more time and money on the planification, because there are a lot of work that has already been done. And about the second part of your question, how can this plan be scaled up across the continent? I mean, it's very simple. Is that when we will be able to leverage the finance for one, and when we will be able to show the success and the real success for one country, so the decision will be very easy for the others, because basically the scheme and the approach, the policy making approach, or even the approach in the ground with the growers, is basically the same all over the African continents, because we have almost the same problematics or challenges, not to say the same problems everywhere.
Thank you so much, Ms. Lamesfair. You've pointed out a really interesting point, and Professor Abdoulaye Dia, I hope the translation is working for him, and he has heard the comments that you made. I want him to specifically, Professor Dia, I'd like you to respond to this question about we have everything we need, the plans, the tools. So all we need to do is actually implement. You have the Great Green Wall in your hands. So would you agree with that? Do we have everything we need?
Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much. I would like, first of all, to say, of course, first I would like to congratulate the government of the Netherlands for having organized the summit. So what do we need? Indeed, we have commitments, investment commitments. That's an important element. We have currently many years of experience in the field of resilience, as well as in the field of the means available. We have a priority investment plan that will allow us to see what is necessary for the 10 coming years. And we know what we have to do. We know what are the necessary means to act. We shouldn't forget that the Great Wall is located at 3 levels. At the local level, that is to say, at the territorial level, that means we have to act with projects at the local level. And there we have currently the tools that are necessary to fulfill the project. The only problem, of course, is mobilizing the financial commitments. And here we have an action plan that should allow us, indeed, to make this possible.
Thank you very much, Professor Dia. We're going to allow the interpretation. Merci beaucoup, Professor Dia.
Thank you very much, Professor, for the translation.
You followed the comments from Professor Dia. Would you agree? I think the ambitions of the Great Green Wall that he outlines, and that actually they are prepared for the next 10 years of activity. What would you say to his point, Abir? Abir, can you hear me? No, she can't hear me. Okay, Professor Dia, we come back to you. La parole à vous encore. So the Great Green Wall Initiative is one of the most ambitious plans to combat the consequences of climate change on the planet. And deservedly, it receives both the attention and the finance, most recently at the One Planet Summit in Paris. So Professor Dia, if the money received equals action, how can we ensure that these commitments will actually lead to significant change for local people on the ground? What will be different this time around?
Of course, with the forum on the investments for the Green Wall, this will. Please first allow me to thank the President Macron for having initiated such a process. Everything is there, as you said. All that we want is that there be a change in paradigm. And one of the speakers said, between relations between partners and the beneficiaries, we should develop a stronger synergy between the partners and the needs of each state. Everything is there, of course. We have an investment plan with different programs. And in particular, we have developed the nexus between restoring land, climate change, and resilient economic development, because it's a totality and we cannot separate the elements. Right now, this investment plan that has been congratulated by all partners should allow us, of course, in the years to come, to generate to restore 100 million acres of degraded soils. We are going to create also 10 million jobs, productive jobs, and we're also going to make sure that that 2.5 we're going to sequestrate 2.5 billion Gs of carbon. This should allow us at the local level to give the capacities back, the adaptive capacities to the communities so that they can be more resilient, to make to also develop the resilience of the ecosystems. All of this integrated in the programs that are developed by the states based on the post-COVID context to guarantee social economic resilience as well as health resilience. It's very important, but this will only be possible with a good communication and especially the involvement of young people, the involvement of women, who are the key elements, of course, on the ground. And right now we have constituted what we call a platform for women, which integrates women in the implementation of the Great Wall, and also an involvement of the young people through what we call the Green Caravan, and also bringing together the different sectorial ministries. It is a holistic approach that we must develop. We have the commitment, we have the economic support, we have the political support by our heads of state. What we need to do now is to concretely set up, of course, this financing at the right moment according to a well-defined planning by the states that benefit from this, and with the support of the international community, we will be there in 2030 with our goals achieved. Merci beaucoup.
We all want to come and work with the Great Green Wall and join that green caravan. Really, really impressive. Professor Dia highlighted the need for a paradigm shift in the partnership with the beneficiaries. That's a really important piece of making this work. The engagement of youth, the engagement of women, really important components, and really impressive, the ambitions, 100 million hectares of land for restoration, 10 million productive jobs. Really, really impressive. Thank you very much, Professor Dia, and thank you, Abir, as well, for this really exciting session. We could have gone on forever, but sadly, we have to move on. Really appreciate it. We'll move on now to our final dialogue on unlocking climate finance. Now, for this important discussion, I'd like to welcome Dauda Jai. He's the lead climate change specialist at the Islamic Development Bank, and Ms. Kulthum Omari-Motsumi. She's a special advisor for the African Adaptation Initiative. Welcome, both of you. Delighted to see you. Now, climate finance has increased significantly since 2015, but I must add, at a much slower pace in the recent years. So if the money is there, what does it take for communities, for countries in Africa to actually benefit from it? We know that significant barriers to access still remain, especially for LDCs. And I don't know of one person in the opening session who did not mention climate finance. So I'll start with you, Mr. Jai. You have been instrumental in developing and steering multilateral finance for adaptation for years, and you've overseen the design and implementation of adaptation projects across Africa and beyond. Can you share your insights on how access has actually improved to unlock action, or has it? Would be great to hear from you, Mr. Jai.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me. I mean, I would be optimistic. I would look at the glass as half full instead of half empty. If we look at what has been done in the last, let's say, in the last 5 years, since the Paris Agreement, for example, You can look at the quality of the adaptation projects that are now being submitted to donors. You can see a clear increase in the quality of the proposals. And we heard from Minister Kaag earlier that there will be more and more support in that aspect, because there is still work to be done, of course, in that area. But clearly, as practitioners, as officers working in multilateral development agencies, we can see that the quality is improving. Another thing is that we can also see that there is an increase in adaptation funding from specialized multilateral funds. You can talk about the Adaptation Fund, the Green Climate Fund, the CIFs. You also see the bilateral funds such as the IKEA from Germany, the Nordic Fund, etc. From those specialized multilateral funds, you can see also that there is clearly an increase in funding over the last years. And lastly, if you look at the multilateral development banks, and the members of the IDFC, all those financial institutions, they are clearly committing very ambitious targets. For instance, if you look at the MDBs in 2019, the MDBs have collectively committed $61 billion in terms of climate finance, of which 14 billion went to adaptation, which was 1/4 of the overall funding, which is really good. And you can see that 4 billion were going, about 4 billion of it went to Africa in general. So these institutions are also increasing they are strengthening their approaches to make sure that all the climate risks are taken into account in the design of the projects and the implementation of the projects. And if you look at, on top of it, the Paris alignment, you can see that you will see more and more funding from the MDBs and from the IDFC, members of the IDFC coming up. Quickly, additional thoughts on what can be done more, maybe increasing domestic finance, which is very important, through the integration of climate resilience in the long-term plans of the countries. You can see that it will be very important. It will help increase the adaptation funding, integration of climate risk, as we learned earlier from the IMF and other banks, that it's key that the central banks and the commercial banks systems take those into account as well. As innovation is also important. And lastly, the development of metrics that will be key to be able to really show results, and that will push for more private sector investment in the future. So I will stop there for now. Thanks.
Thank you, Dauda. Thank you so much. Kulthum, I want to turn to you. When I listen to Mr. Diaye, it sounds like we should be doing quite well, but I still hear voices saying, show me the money. There's no finance flowing. How much better are we doing? Do you feel as buoyant as that?
Good afternoon, and thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak at this very important initiative, and also just to thank the Dutch government for putting this together. It's a well-needed, much-needed initiative. Just to respond very quickly to what Dauda has just spoken about, and that it's great that we have all these other opportunities for accessing fund, and some of the opportunities that he didn't mention include the recent GCF decision to fund national adaptation plans, up to $3 million US. And I can tell you now what we have in the NEP Central, which is the platform where we submit the national adaptation plans. We only have 7 for African countries. And that speaks volume, because we are 54 countries in Africa and only 7 have been able to access that funding. Now, what are the reasons for that? So I think we can safely acknowledge that adaptation in the past decade, as was said earlier, has increased. Adaptation funding has increased, but there exist persistent barriers and systematic barriers, what I would term the missing middle, that block this flow of funding to where it's needed the most. And I'll mention a few. One of it is the accreditation process for these multilateral funds. And there's been a lot of talk around hand-holding, making the accreditation process a little bit light. So light accreditation for those countries and organizations that are not able to access those funding because of the onerous requirements that are required for these countries and these organizations to have in place before they can access funding. So while the funds are there, many countries are still struggling to access. So hand-holding may be required for countries that are really need and don't have the capacity. Another issue that has been blocking financing is what we call the climate rationale, or the need to demonstrate that there is a climate basis for a particular project. Now, as you know, we are really struggling as African countries to have sound and recent data that is downscaled to the most appropriate level. So without that kind of data, without that kind of analysis that is able to justify why a project should be funded, it becomes problematic for some countries to receive funding because they're not able to demonstrate the science aspects of a particular adaptation project. So this is also problematic because it blocks funding to flow to African countries while it's there. The third one that I would like to highlight is co-financing. There's been a lot of push for leveraging from the private sector, which is problematic for African countries because the private sector is not as vibrant in African countries as it is in other areas. Therefore, funding, requiring funding from the private sector may not be feasible. Therefore, countries, as Dauda talked about, countries are beginning to invest in adaptation. They've been investing in adaptation. In fact, the most recent study talks about 2% of our national GDP goes to adaptation activities. So domestic investment in adaptation has always been there. And perhaps this is an opportunity for funders, in order to lessen the burden of the co-financing, to consider in-kind contributions such as the adaptation funding that they've been doing from domestic resources. And finally, just something that we've talked about before and we keep talking about is this complicated jargon and language that is required to put proposals together. I acknowledge, as Dauda said, that proposals are becoming, the quality of proposals is improved, which is great, but we still need to develop those proposals, support from international consultants, which really undermines local expertise when we have to bring in international consultants to do our proposals because of the complexity of this entire process. So in a nutshell, if we break down these barriers, if we break down these systematic barriers that block the flow of funds from international sources to where it's needed the most, we may begin to address and enhance adaptation action in the continent.
Kulthum, Dauda, thank you both so much. I suspect this will be the subject of our discussions going forward. We're going to have to and even more. I want to invite Ambassador Seni Nafo he's a technical coordinator of the Africa Adaptation Initiative, Special Advisor on Africa for GCA. Share your reflections, Seni. We've heard a lot today. We've heard so much around this issue. Where are we? What next? Seni, thank you.
Well, thank you, Wanjira. What I've heard from Kitty, from DG Kitty, which is to me very important, is that we have to listen. We have to listen from the ground. I'm very happy that when talking to the youth, they mentioned governance, drought-resistant seeds, solar water pumps. I had a similar discussion with women in agriculture, 800 kilometers from the capital city of Mali, right in the middle of the desert. And what they said were basically, we need water. We need, actually, we're spending a lot of money on diesel, so solar water pumps. And last time we bought some seeds and then we didn't grow anything. So we need some good seeds. So I think that that first point was listening to the ground, listening to those who are on the front line. The three panels, I think, addressed three main points: institutions, actions, and finance. DG Leslie talked about partnership and the importance of public and private coming together for sure. More than 70 to 80% of Africans actually depend on the private sector. And that's private sector, that is one woman taking care of her children and growing vegetable. That's private sector. Ato Gebru, going beyond the sectoral approach to integrating climate in national development planning processes. That's something Ethiopia did since 2009 or 10, the CRGE, Climate Resilient and Green Economy Strategy, looking at the long term, extremely important, as well as the local access. Only 10% of the climate finance go to the local, and I think the Life AR initiative wants to increase that to 70%. The point from Professor Jia, which is to me extremely philosophical, I'm still reflecting on that. We need to change the paradigm of relationship between the partners and the needs of the state. That's interesting. So somehow we've been talking to each other forever, but it seems that we're still talking past each other. So definitely a platform like this one, and I want to thank the Netherlands government for providing that platform. We need more of talking together and talking instead of talking at each other. On finance, Dauda, I like your perspective. We must look at the bright side and the half full, the cup. Kulthum touched about some of the barriers. I think I want to further unlock that. I think she mentioned 4 barriers that we need to unlock to really have the existing finance further flowing. I want to add a bit more. And I call it, we have a capacity gaps matrix. And you have three gaps there. Or capacity. Let's call them capacity. Because this is positive, and I want to be looking at the positive side. You need to have the capacity to formulate science policy action. You need the capacity to mobilize public, private instruments, and this is where the fiduciary standards come into play. You need the capacity to execute, to coordinate, to mobilize at local level, or to direct finance at local level. It's a full-time job. This is what we realize. This is a full-time job. You don't learn that at Ministry of Environment. You don't learn that at Ministry of Agriculture. You need full-time expertise to do that. And we are coming together as different initiatives, AAA, AAI, GCA, and others, to really have that specific expertise of how do you mobilize the resources, how do you make it with the content that is needed for those who are on the ground. Final pillar, which nobody talked about, and I think which is extremely important for action, is information, the data. You need the climate data. You need to generate that data, translate that data into information, and then translate that information into policy. I think that's extremely important to unlock action. I think I'll stop there. That was the final point.
Seni, thank you very much. Always so clear and crisp. Let's continue talking about this, and certainly with each other and not at each other. Lexter, so sad that we have to close this lively discussion, but over to you at the studio.
Yes, we have already come to the end of the session, but our work doesn't end with CIAS, Climate Adaptation Summit. We are looking ahead to the COP26, and I'm honored to welcome His Excellency James Duddridge, Minister for Africa of the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom has a leading role as COP26 president. How can we sustain the momentum during this important year?
Thank you. Thank you to Kitty and Wanjira and to everyone who's made this such a useful session. Thank you to our hosts for putting together an important conference, and for the Netherlands' continued climate leadership. Today has truly shown that there is a growing consensus that this is the decade when we must come together to turn the tables on climate change. Clearly, we need to put carbon emissions and the destruction of the environment into reverse. And equally, it's clear we need to adapt to live with temperature rises and the damaging weather extremes that are already happening. So that's why building climate resilient societies and economies is such a priority for the UK's COP26 presidency. And that's why the UK government supports the least developed countries as they plot their path through the challenges of climate change. Over the past 5 years, we've invested almost £6 billion in the international climate finance. And we've also pledged a further 11.6 billion over the next 5 years. Now, we aim to spend half of that on adaptation and resilience. As part of that, we're supporting the initiative Life AR, the least developed countries initiative for effective adaptation and resilience. And we're working with 6 African frontrunner countries to help them identify their adaptation priorities. The private sector also has a key role to play. Companies such as Sun Culture in Kenya, who are providing solar-powered irrigation systems to smallholders, saving water and boosting yields. Initiatives like PropCom in Nigeria are helping out more than 500,000 farmers become climate resilient, including embracing sustainable forestry and timber products. Scaling up solutions like these to support African communities is now urgent. Today, the UK Prime Minister launched the new Adaptation Action Coalition to drive forward adaptation across Africa and the world. The coalition includes some of our key partners, such as Egypt and Malawi in Africa, and will invite other countries to join. The Race to Resilience, launched today by the UN Climate Champions team, clearly can be the catalyst that's needed for a step change. In the build up to COP26 and beyond, we want to work with all of you to make its vision of climate resilience for 4 billion people from vulnerable communities a reality. We promise to use our G7 presidency to advance a resilient recovery and to increase climate finance, including for adaptation. We will continue to support the African Union to develop their Greener Recovery Action Plan, and we will work with the African presidency to deliver a successful COP27. When we come together as an international community, we can truly achieve remarkable things. If we urgently scale up adaptation, we can help communities that are vulnerable to the ravages of climate change and find a way through. Ladies and gentlemen, that is in all our interests. Thank you for today's conference.
Thank you, Mr. Minister, for giving us a glimpse of the way forward and for your presence here today. Sadly, that's about all the time we have left. Kitty, I want to come back to you, your reflections on the minister's remarks and also your final reflections as we draw this session to a close.
Thank you, Wanjira. And, you know, as I said, I would listen, I learned, and I loved it. I mean, AAA contributions, fantastic. AAA, because this is about ambition, it's about action, and it's about acceleration. And James, I'm going to hold your hand, because from this summit, we're going to make sure that in Glasgow, we embed adaptation with the priority that it requires. And Africa must be at the heart of that priority. And why do we do that? Well, because climate action, climate adaptation simply makes good sense. One, and we've heard that today from our panelists, we know what needs to happen. We know that there's local knowledge and international knowledge, and that we just need to enable African organizations, governments, and micro-initiatives to unlock the data, as Saini said, to develop bankable projects. We know that it simply makes good economic sense. I'm an economist by background. I wish my portfolio would look like the rate of return that adaptation yields. 1 in 5 to 1 in 10 for early warning and for nature-based solutions on infrastructure. Who wouldn't wish that? And last but not least, point 3, because we simply must. This is a moral obligation. We promised people in 2015 at Paris and with the SDGs the perspective of a life in dignity. We cannot succeed in that agenda unless we adapt to climate change that we in the West have created for poor people that had nothing to do with it. Now I want to make one important point, which is around innovative partnerships, because that was the red thread for me across all the contributions. I mean, for me, it is about building those partnerships. It is about listening and working together, and that requires trust. It requires listening not just to those that we're accustomed to work with, but also to involve those that are in the margins, those that are poor. They know exactly what it is they need, if only we were to open our minds to them. Young people, women, urban poor. And we know, and we have seen with the Great Green Wall, that we can take micro initiatives, micro business initiatives, put them together and scale them to transformative impact for poor people. So if there's one big lesson, it is that we know that multiple small-scale, localized solutions work much better than one solution thought after from this big table. So let us hear to those people that are in need. Let us make sure that innovation is not highbrow, high cost, high tech, but that innovation is a mindset, and it's a mindset that brings poor people to the center of our decisions and our action. And James, that's what we are going to deliver in Glasgow.
Great, that is beautiful. Thank you so much, Director General van der Heider, for everything and for your presence. And thank you, Wanjira, for moderating this session.
Thank you, Lexter.
Great. And again, thank you to all of our speakers, and of course, thank you for watching. The Climate Adaptation Summit continues with many more sessions to come. And don't forget to take a look at the cinema on the platform for much more content. My name is Lex Woodley. It was my pleasure to be your host. See you next time. And again, thank you.